So, how hard is the Lethal Zone? Plus, even more tips for Lethal Zone from the Funks. That's going to be the two subjects of our video. First half will be how hard is Lethal Zone, and second half will be Funks' tips for the Lethal Zone. So, let's get started. This is going to be a continuation from the initial how hard is Lethal Zone question I presented. After I completed the first season of Lethal Zone, when I completed the Builder's Legacy, I said, this is how hard I think it is. But then I said, I will give my thoughts a second time after I get all four of the Legacies done. And, well, here we are. So I want you to begin visualizing, take a guess, on a scale of 0 to 10, where do you think Funks is going to put it, especially after hearing this? So, out of the 4 seasons, for those of you who didn't watch, 3 of the 4 seasons were completely deathless, and that included the first season where I put additional handicaps on myself. No DLC, no OP things, had to, do it their old rocks and sticks method just to kind of show that having no experience with the Lethal Zone, I'm going to get through it. And we didn't have any deaths. The one death I did have, I believe, was in Season 3, and that was because I walked away from the game while I was waiting for nighttime to become daytime, because I like to record the videos in the game's daytime, and of course the computer found a way to get itself killed. So, knowing that situation, what's it going to be on a scale of 0 to 10? Well, here it's coming at you. It's going to be a 7. Now, numbers are great and all, but what does a 7 out of 10 mean? This is how I'll describe it. A 7 out of 10, it's hard, but no more and no less. There's no need to attach any additional words. It's not like, super extra, oh my God, it's the hardest thing ever. There's no need to, attach anything. It's not ultra hardcore. It's just hard. That's really just the best way to describe it. It's not easy. It's not insanely hard. And it's more than average. Now, the interesting thing is, those of you who have paid attention to my various conversations will know that I also gave the Nightmare Zone basically a 7. So, since I know this, and I'm making a video where I'm calling Lethal Zone a 7 and Nightmare Zone a 7, well, how can that be? Does that mean Nightmare Zone should drop to a 6? Or should Lethal Zone be like a 7.25 or like a 7.5 for logical consistency? And my answer is actually no. I actually think it's very important to say that Lethal Zone and Nightmare Zone are both a 7, because I want to sell this really interesting perspective that I think I have on it, that it's something that I experienced really in probably the first 2 seasons, and I realized that this was going to be the fate of the Lethal Zone. You see, sure, it's true. The Lethal Zone, the numbers are all crazy. The damage is cranked up, and the blood plague, it kills you so fast, and half of the buildings have been looted. But here is the thing. In your process of becoming a better State of Decay player, in your process of mastering the Nightmare Zone, the lessons that you have ironed out, the things that you have gotten better at, are more than enough to carry you through the Lethal Zone, probably without much trouble. And here's what I mean. Let's take damage first. Yeah, the damage is crazy. They do so much more damage in Lethal Zone. But the thing is, they already did quite a bit of damage in the Nightmare Zone, and in training in the Nightmare Zone, in mastering the combat of Nightmare Zone, you already have adapted a playstyle of not taking damage. Why? Well, because you want to be efficient with your medical supplies, and the most efficient way to be good with your medical supplies is to, not use them, and the damage that they're capable of doing in the Nightmares, about to say Lethal Zone, but in the Nightmare Zone is already high enough that it's just not a good idea. You'll just be chugging down painkillers like crazy. So what you do is you just adapt to not get hit. Or if you do get hit, you're not getting hit that hard. Like, you're getting hit by zombie scratches or zombie punches, but you're not getting bit very often. So when you go to the lethal zone, the zombies don't fight any different. There might be more of them. There already were a lot in Nightmare Zone, though, so there might be a bit more of them, but they don't fight any differently. So there's no difference between the lethal zone zombies fighting style and the Nightmare Zone zombies fighting style. So your training to not get hit in the Nightmare Zone means that the increased damage that the zombies do in the lethal zone, well, it just kind of doesn't matter. The same is true for the Blood Plague. Oh my god, like, it kills you in 5 minutes. And sure, like, 5 minutes isn't a lot of time, but once again, your adaptations in the Nightmare Zone will protect you because, one, you have trained to not take damage, especially to not get bit by zombies, and that's one of the primary ways you're going to get the Blood Plague. You already know not to mess around with Plague Juggernauts because it's a waste of time. And so you get into this situation where you're just not going to get full-blown Blood Plague very often, and your adaptation in Lethal Zone is just to carry a cure on you, just in case. So once again, sure, on paper, it makes a big difference, but in practice, you really just shouldn't be getting Blood Plague all that frequently because you play in a safer, or you play in a more cautious manner, or you're very on point with your dodging, or you understand that this is a bad situation, so I'm either not going to get into it, or I'm realizing it's becoming ugly, so I'm going to run away. You just don't get into the situations where the increased damage of the lethal zone and the increased Blood Plague infection is really able to make a big enough difference to knock that 7 out of 10 up into even a 7.5. And the last example I want to give is the idea of the loot scarcity. So half of the loot is gone in the lethal zone. Well, did you need more than half of the loot in Nightmare Zone? Of course not. Like, maybe if you were staying for like 100 days and you're staying for a long time, but if you're just playing like normal to complete the legacy, I'm not even talking about a speed run, you're just playing at a normal pace, maybe a brisk pace, you don't need half of the loot. So when they take half the loot away from you, it might seem scary at first, but ultimately, you don't even need the full half of the loot that the lethal zone offers you, because you know a lot of alternative ways to get the resources too. You know how to trade with your allies. You know how to use the radio commands to contact the Red Talon or the network in order to locate supplies. You know how to use a trade depot. So you know all of these additional ways to compensate for the fact that half of the resources are gone, and you didn't even need a full half of the resources to begin with. And that's what I mean by, the funny thing is, despite it just factually being true that the lethal zone is harder, like the numbers are bigger where it's scary, and the numbers are smaller when it's scary. They either do more damage, or there's less loot, or the morale is an issue, or they're gobbling up all the food, but that's just what's funny about it. The process of mastering the Nightmare Zone is sufficient in bringing your player skill to such a comprehensive point that the lethal zone, it can't leverage the increased difficulty against you in an especially meaningful way. Now, there are certainly things about lethal zone that still require some adaptation to. One example is it'll take them a moment to adapt to a blood feral, because it is a bit different, and it also has the ability to plague you. And especially when Lethal Zone first came out, the Blood Plague Feral could still infect you, even if you made a clean dodge from it. So, I mean, it's not to say that there aren't... And another big one is that it can ram the doors off of your car. So it's not to say that the Lethal Zone is completely impotent. It's just an issue that, despite the increases of difficulty, the Nightmare Zone is the first difficulty of State of Decay 2, where you really just have to learn, maybe not all of the game, but you have to learn most of the game in a really comprehensive manner. That when you do that, when you do exactly that, when you have learned the game in a comprehensive manner at the Nightmare Zone level, well, the lethal zone, it's basically in the bag. And that's why, yeah, I mean, I had struggles in the nightmare zone. We had multiple deaths in the nightmare zone, even though I was able to get through them cleanly. But I mean, let's be honest here. Like, I went through the lethal zone even easier than the nightmare zone. And I specifically set up the lethal zone to try and like screw myself over by doing a fresh start, no DLC, like none of the OP things, just to try to make it as ruthless as I could, without doing something like, like fork only, no car, like stab every plague heart to death with like a cooking knife or something. But I tried to make it where it was just like this really, like you had to use the rocks and stick elements of the game, no pyro launcher, no trade depot, none of that crazy stuff. And we still went through it just fine. And so that's what I mean. It's kind of paradoxical that the Nightmare Zone and the Lethal Zone are both 7s out of 10s, but I think you'll agree after listening to this that it makes a really interesting point. And I think it says a lot for you as the player that, like, learning the Nightmare Zone thoroughly, it's gonna help you slap the Lethal Zone. Like, you don't have to train at the Lethal Zone to really be ready for it. You can train at the Nightmare Zone, and I think you'll find if you can do a Nightmare Zone from scratch with no DLC and let's say 0 to 1 deaths, yeah, I would be shocked if you could not also overcome the lethal zone pretty handily. Anyways, let's go into the next segment, though. We're going to talk about the tips for the lethal zone. Alright, so in my last tips that I gave in one of these little vlogs, I talked about stuff like, how to loot and how to like process all of your loot and get the most out of it so that you can basically throw 100% of your resources at the lethal zone. This time, I want to talk about stuff like taking aim at your weaknesses, as well as just like gaining an awareness for how the game unfolds, perhaps in a way you haven't thought of it before, because this will affect your decision-making and your coolness under stress. So my first tip is I want you to face your fears, and I want you to not have crutches, but rather tools. So let's talk about the first one. Face your fears. I want you to think about anything in State of Decay 2 that makes you feel uncomfortable. Anything that makes your chest kind of tighten up a little bit, like, oh God, I don't like that. Here's a great example. Are you afraid of ferals? If the answer is yes, I want you to go ahead, knock down the difficulty if you want, but grab a whole bunch of like medical stuff. Go ahead and turn on like primary care so that you're resistant to injuries, stuff like that, and just start fighting some ferals in melee combat. Not just once either. I want you to fight them multiple times. Get your car nearby so that you can, like, if you need to abandon the fight, you can. But fight these ferals in melee combat and fight more than one of them. Is another good example would be let ferals chase you. Like, get a feral, get its attention, set a timer for like 5 minutes and just run away from it. Run through buildings, run over fences, just let it chase you. Like, just get used to the pressure of a feral being on you. The main strength of the feral isn't its damage, it's not its speed, it's the fear it causes, which makes you perform suboptimal decision making. It makes you fight less strategically because you're more concerned with like, oh my God, it's gonna get me, instead of just like reacting to it like, okay, you're just a fast zombie that's tougher than normal. Like, this is how I deal with you. Like, you need to like look at what are the things that the feral is the best at. The feral is really good at melee combat. Well, meet it face to face and beat that feral's butt in melee combat. Like, fight it on its own home field and dominate it. Let it chase you around. That's its other big strength, is being able to like, run really fast. Just let it chase you for a few minutes. Like, just jump over fences and watch. Like, don't just fight it and don't just run. Watch and observe. Watch how the model of the feral moves, how it fights, how it climbs up things. And as you do this, you're going to find that the more you fight them, the more you let them chase you, this tension, this like tightness that you're feeling, this pressure, it might still be there, but it won't be as big of a deal. Like when you watch me play, there's a lot of bad situations I get into, and yeah, I might fall quiet and I might not give as much commentary because now I'm concentrating, but you don't really notice me panic very often, and that's because by doing a lot of the challenge playthroughs I've done, I've subjected myself to these really weird situations where it's much harder to startle me. It's much harder to phase me. Now, if a weird glitch happens that like throws my car, something crazy, like that might stun me. It might cause me to get dazed. I might lose my concentration. But by subjecting myself to suboptimal battles, like fighting a feral in melee combat would be considered suboptimal. You'd much rather, just shoot it with gunslinging. But by intentionally subjecting yourself to what that zombie is good at, you will gain a respect both for yourself and the proper respect for the feral. If you're afraid of the feral, you're giving it too much respect. And by fighting it in melee combat, you will not respect it any more than it needs to be. Now, the other half of this is the idea that I don't want you to use powerful things as a crutch. I want you to use them as a tool. And the way to tell if you're using something as a crutch or a tool is to play without it. If you play with the pyro launcher, let's be honest with yourself. Can you play without it? Would you feel uncomfortable playing without the pyro launcher? If the answer is yes, then you're using it as a crutch, and that means you do want to play without it. That's good news. Like if you feel worried about playing without the pyro launcher, well, good. You've just identified an aspect of the game that you can get better at. And by getting better at all these individual things, you will understand the game more comprehensively. Because if you can't use a trade depot, if you can't use a pyro launcher, if you can't use red talon, if you can't use the really powerful things in the game, you'll have to use the next most powerful thing. And maybe you don't have that, so you'll have to use the third most powerful thing. And these will cause you to have to learn the game holistically, as in you will need to learn every element of the game, how they interact, and what this means is you're not going to feel disarmed. That's why I did the first season of Lethal Zone without the pyro launcher, without all those things, just to demonstrate that I'm not going to be phased. I use them because I enjoy it, but I can play just fine without them. And that's because I play both with and without these things, even on the highest difficulty. And by playing without them, you will understand every single little thing in the game and how you're just surrounded by all these opportunities that you didn't notice because always using the most powerful things causes you to not explore the game and therefore sleep on other valuable mechanics. Now, finally, I want to talk about this idea of power spikes. What is a power spike? Well, a power spike is something that happens in the game. Maybe it's an item you get, maybe it's just a stage of the game. It's in every single game, but in State of Decay, we've got these power spikes, and when you obtain one of them, they make you really, really strong. And being aware of these power spikes, they let you do the two sides of the coin. When you are in between a power spike, or when you haven't even gotten your first power spike, you know you need to play a little more cautiously. But when you have entered into a power spike, you know that now you can play more aggressively, and so they're going to save two things. By playing safely, you save lives. By playing more aggressively when the time is correct, you save time. And by being aware of the existence of these power spikes and what they are, it's going to almost make you seem like kind of like you're psychic by other people watching, because they'll be like, how do you know how to play cautiously, and how do you know when to play aggressively? And it's all because you just know how strong you are in relationship to the game. So let's go over some of these power spikes so you can start getting into this mentality. Now, I'm going to classify them as early, mid, and late game power spikes, but to be honest, they don't necessarily have an order. For example, you might import a character that already has some of these items, And so one example is the 50 caliber rifle. Now think about it. When you don't have a 50 caliber rifle and you're in like the lethal zone, and let's say you're playing from scratch, well, a juggernaut is pretty scary because you're like, God, I don't necessarily have the firepower. I might get blood plague, and that's really, really bad when I'm not ready to deal with it. But once you've got a 50 caliber rifle, it screws those juggernauts because your allies have infinite ammo, especially when you get like 2 or 3 of them. And then suddenly you kind of want the juggernauts to come just so that they can get like destroyed by your 50 caliber rifles. And what did you just do? You just turned a threatening enemy into a supply of blood plague samples, which is really good in the early game. That's an example of playing cautiously at first, but then being more aggressive and turning that into your advantage by being aware of a power spike. Another example would be like the pyro launcher. You can get that in the first third of the game. The daybreak items, your red talon characters. An example of a mid-game power spike would be like setting up your trade depot. It would be getting into specific character skills like powerhouse and close combat, especially when together, as well as gunslinging. It's going to be something like having primary care in the infirmary with a person with the knowledge of surgery. And then your late game power spikes would be something like having a scent block, or having access to the bloater gas, or getting the skills necessary to have a C4, or having the completely maxed out primary care, which is the level 3 infirmary with knowledge of surgery and knowledge of pathology, which just makes you so hard to kill, even in the lethal zone. And so by knowing these power spikes, you know kind of like what you should or should not be doing. For example, if you don't have bloater gas, maybe you shouldn't be messing around with hostile enclaves. If you don't have C4 or, once again, bloater gas, in other words, if you don't have a way to easily destroy plague guards, well, maybe you shouldn't mess with them. If you don't have maxed out primary care, maybe you should not be as reckless. Maybe you shouldn't be fast searching in lethal zone, something that could get you into a lot of trouble without something to basically be your safety net in the event you make get into kind of a bad situation. When you don't have the trade depot and you're not able to get your resources, maybe you should be a little more cautious. Maybe you shouldn't be making a ton of ammo, or maybe you shouldn't be making crossbow bolts when you haven't secured a reliable source of materials. So by knowing these power spikes, you know when you should be a little more cautious, but you also know when it's now time to press the advantage, get in there and make a difference and make the big plays. So by playing around and with power spikes, it's going to make your game much more intelligent, because you know when to avoid trouble and when to turn trouble into a big advantage. Anyways, there you go. That's what I think about the lethal zone. Those are some more of my tips. A little more metaphysical on the tips, but honestly, I think these more metaphysical tips like this are the things that take you from the intermediate into the advanced. It's these conceptual things that are really what's going to, once they click in your head, once you get the idea, that's what takes your game into the next level. It's what gets you from the dread zone into the nightmare zone, and from the nightmare zone into the lethal zone. So tell me what you think down in the comment section. On a scale of 0 to 10, what do you think the lethal zone is? Do you agree with my analysis? If you're a master of the nightmare zone, and maybe even of the lethal zone, do you agree that that once you learned how to play the nightmare zone, that lethal zone wasn't really that big of a deal? And what do you think about these tips? Are you someone who you know that you have these fears and you don't face them? And are you aware that these are the things that are preventing you from becoming the get good player that you are, that you really could be? And same with things like power spikes. Have you ever even thought of the game in that manner? Have you thought about the idea that there are certain things in the game that just make you wildly more powerful, and that by being more cautious before it and also more aggressive after it, you can create a sense of momentum in the game? Let me know what you think down in the comment section. Anyways, like the video if it was entertaining. Subscribe for future State of Decay 2 content. And of course, remember that you don't have to be good to get good.